Welcome to our channel. Today we have a special story that sounds not just creepy, but really sinister. This story came to us from the darkest corners of a psychiatric hospital. Prepare to experience something incredible, because what I'm going to tell you has become a cause for serious concern, even among mental health professionals. In a small and quiet town where all the houses seemed the same and the routine days passed monotonously, there was an old mansion on the outskirts. This house was known for its mysterious feature, which began exactly a year ago. From 10 to 12 at night, every evening, the light in one of the windows of this house began to blink. Flickering light that seemed to be not only physical, but also an unknown evil behind its glass. A local resident named Tom, who lived in the house opposite, could not understand the reason for this strange phenomenon. Every evening, sitting by the window, he watched as the light, steady at first and then flickering and flashing, suddenly began to blink with frightening regularity. His curiosity gradually turned into unbearable anxiety, especially when he noticed that this phenomenon was repeated day after day and could not find any logical explanation. Tom tried to figure it out by going to the house to see what was going on. He noticed that all the windows were tightly curtained and nothing could be seen behind the closed curtains. He tried to notice any signs of activity or change, but the house remained in shadow, full of gloomy silence. Finally, after a year of constant observation and agonizing anxiety, Tom decided to go into the house and find out what was going on. In the evening, when the lights started blinking again, he went to the door of the mansion and rang the bell. A few minutes later, the door opened and a strange man in his 40s stood in front of him. His face was hidden in shadow and his gaze was blank and distant. The man quickly explained that the reason for the blinking of the light was simply a problem with the wiring. When Tom tried to ask him to fix it, the man coldly refused and slammed the door in his face. The smell coming from the man was strange and unpleasant, as if a mixture of stale air and something rotten. This smell penetrated even through the door and was inhaled by Tom when he stood outside. Even more strange was that a surveillance camera was installed near the house, one of the few in the area. None of the neighboring houses had cameras, and this only increased Tom's sense of suspicion. Deciding that the case was not clean, Tom continued to observe. He noticed that every evening, when the light started to blink, the camera also recorded his movements. A viewer who was watching the footage from the camera might have noticed strange shapes and shadows flickering in the window, which added even more mystery to the situation. Tom, unable to get rid of the feeling of anxiety and fear, decided to continue his investigation, despite the dangers that he might encounter. One night, when the light started flickering again with particular ferocity, he came closer to the house, believing that something important might happen. This time, he used an old set of tools to carefully open the back door that led to the basement of the house. Inside, he found a staircase leading down into pitch darkness. His heart began to beat faster, but he pulled himself together and went down. Since he couldn't find any light source, he turned on his flashlight to light the way. When Tom entered the basement, he was greeted by a suffocating smell of rot and chemicals. In the corner, he saw piles of old medical instruments, covered with a layer of rust and something more terrible, traces resembling blood and organic residues. This terrible sight made him shudder, but he continued to search. In one of the rooms in the basement, he found a huge book bound in old leather. Pages were filled with incomprehensible symbols and drawings depicting rituals and creepy rituals. Each image seemed alive, almost sinister, and he couldn't take his eyes off one drawing showing a man tied to a medical table surrounded by demonic figures. Tom casually looked into one of the rooms and noticed terrible details. Decomposed human bodies surrounded by strange symbols that were scratched right on the floor and walls. The corpses were distorted in creepy poses, and many of them were subjected to terrible torments, as if they were part of some diabolical ritual. Looking into another room, Tom came across a dark underground chamber. A medical table was set up in the center of this chamber, surrounded by instruments covered with old blood. On the table was a creepy mask made of human skin, and tied to it with old rusty nails. there was an old cupboard in the corner of the room, from which came terrible creaking sound. Tom opened the closet and found something more terrible inside. A whole set of antique cameras and video players recorded the horrific scenes of violence and torment taking place in the house. On one of the video players, he saw a recording where a group of people, tied up and scared, were subjected to excruciating torture to ominous laughter. Tom felt fear creep over him as he realized that this was all part of some kind of perverted experiment. Tom, despite all the terrible pain and fear he felt, managed to break free from the grip. His torments and sufferings, however, left indelible traces in him. He exerted his exhausted strength and used every remaining energy to free himself from the ropes and fall off the medical table. In horror and panic, he ran past the man, who was startled by his unexpected escape. After getting out of the basement, Tom stumbled into the backyard. The walls of the house seemed even more ominous in the light of dawn, but his fear made him move on. He reached the road, where he was discovered by bystanders who noticed his hysterical state and blood-stained clothes. When he was taken to the hospital, his condition turned out to be so severe that doctors immediately sent him to a psychiatric institution. There he was placed under close supervision, and his mental state was quickly assessed as extremely unstable. At the psychiatric hospital, Tom often told his story, sharing his terrible experiences with staff and other patients. His stories were full of detailed descriptions of creepy rituals, scary corpses, and sinister figures. But despite his persistence and fury in his stories, many considered him psychotic and unable to distinguish reality from his terrible hallucinations. The hospital staff repeatedly checked his story. They even visited the house, but found it completely empty and in perfect order, with no signs of any terrible cult or rituals. All the surveillance cameras and recordings they found did not contain anything suspicious. Just the usual records of those who entered and left the house, without any traces of violence or torment. Many doctors and nurses began to believe that Tom was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, which caused him to hallucinate and distort reality. However, despite this, there was something in his stories that could not be ignored. His fear was too real, his details too precise. One day, when Tom was telling his story to other patients again, he began to notice strange things. Patients who had previously listened to him with curiosity or disbelief now began to take his stories more seriously. Some of them even started pointing out strange coincidences in his stories that could not be accidental. One of the patients claimed to have seen in his own nightmares the same symbols and rituals that Tom described. Soon after, some of the medics working with Tom began to discover strange and unexplained things in the facility itself. Several surveillance cameras began to show strange interference, and some reports on the condition of patients began to indicate eerie changes in their behavior. These events began to create an atmosphere of confusion and fear among the staff. Tom continued his story, and each new coincidence or strange incident only added fuel to the fire. Despite all efforts to declare him insane, the increasingly complex and sinister events that took place in the hospital began to weave into his story. The staff and patients of the psychiatric hospital realized that Tom's fear could be part of something scarier. The horror he had experienced had penetrated into every corner of their own world.